Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Flori Lazier, and I'm the president and CEO of Corporate Council on Africa. I see others must have been experiencing what I was coming in today from Maryland, so I expect we'll have some more to come. We are very pleased to be having this second session of our Africa Economic Outlook for 2023 today. For many years, CCA has invited top experts to share their expectations for the African economic outlook as a way to help companies set the stage for their trade and investment activities for the year. These presentations have tended to provide useful opportunities to get thoughtful perspectives on some of the more important structural changes African economies are undergoing. This year, there is an unusually large number of issues to unpack. We held the first session of this series on February 16th, and we're honored to have Dr. Hanan Morsi, the Deputy Executive Secretary of UNECA, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, offer her thoughts to kick us off. Themes we discussed at the first session included the fact that the world is still coping with the after effects of the pandemic and related supply chain disruptions, as well as the impacts of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine, including a sustained spike in food and energy prices and heightened food insecurity in too many places in the world. These challenges have hit Africa harder than many other places and regions and have exacerbated underlying issues, including aggravating debt servicing and government financing, making it harder for African governments to put in place economic recovery plans. Despite these challenges, African countries are making important headway in implementing the game-changing African Continental Free Trade Agreement, along with important initiatives to support increased manufacturing of medical products and industrialization more broadly on the continent, and advancing priority transportation corridors. I'm delighted today to continue the conversation on these important themes, and I'm honored to welcome Dr. Andrew Dabelin, who is the Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. Dr. Dabelin, we always enjoyed hearing from your predecessor, Dr. Zufak, and we're delighted to continue the tradition of welcoming you to offer your expectations for Africa's outlook in 2023. Before I turn it over to Dr. Dabelin, I want to go over some housekeeping rules for the question session. For those joining us virtually, please use the Zoom chat function to send us your questions. We look forward to asking them as time permits. And we'll take questions only from those who provide their name and affiliation. So please do remember when you put in your question in the chat to include your name and your affiliation. And now I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Dabelin to the podium.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time, in part because I'm very new to this job. I started in July of 2022. And this is the first product that I actually had to work on as the chief economist for the Africa region. For those of you who who are not familiar with the World Bank's organograms, I will mostly be talking about sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure you cover all of Africa. It's a huge continent, but North Africa is not an area of, it's not administratively an area I cover. So a lot of what I will be talking about is really basically just relevant for sub-Saharan Africa. So it's really important for us to understand that from the beginning. Now, the second thing I'm going to say is that what you're going to hear about is basically an outlook, a medium-term outlook, 12, 18 months, right? And because of the time we are in, it will seem a little bit gloom. But that does not mean, that should not color your views about what's actually happening in the continent if you take a longer, medium-term, view of the continent. And we'll be happy to talk about that. We could also be talking about some of the things that African countries are doing to deal with this unprecedented polycrisis. But in the interest of time, what I was going to do is just to lay out the context in which these countries are operating. So a lot of what I will be talking about is really like the challenges that they're facing. Now, the PowerPoint actually has some ideas about some of the things that African countries can do, and that is in their power to do to deal with this crisis. But I will not be able to go into details of that in this presentation. So with that, let me just tell you the outlook that I'm going to give you is a little bit. First of all, is a little bit of a recent outlook, which is more like looking at what happened in 2022. Typically, what we have is this outlook is about biannual. So we usually release it in October of every year and also April of every year. So we are currently actually working feverishly on the one for April, because we need to release it before our spring spring annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF. So I'll be happy to come and give you an update. But for now, we will talk a little bit about what has been happening in 2022, and then what is beginning to emerge as a storyline for 2023. So here is a picture. The slowdown now. So the first picture, I think, is what's happening to growth, because growth summarizes a lot of what happens in economic activity of a society, right? And you can see that, in fact, what happened is that growth slowdown did not start with the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic was a massive shock, but the growth slowdown actually started because of a shock in the commodity prices for African countries, right? And this is a story that you're going to hear a lot, because I think the African countries, a lot of the African, taken separately, are very small economies, very connected to the global markets. They trade a lot, but the sources of their trade is a very narrow base. Usually minerals, oil and gas, maybe agricultural commodity exports, right? It's not very diverse. Very few of them actually have very diverse exports. And because of that, their growth is always incredibly sensitive to what happens to the global economy, okay? And because of the pandemic and the Ukraine war, the global economy was obviously downgraded severely, right? And that mattered a lot for African countries. So here is an example of what happened to global trade. This is high frequency data sets. It's not the most pretty picture, but nonetheless, you can see that what it shows is basically the sentiment of, your clients, basically, managers who run factories and businesses, right? And it's their sentiment, basically, about the global economy. And what you see is, dark colors usually are positive. Green is usually an expansion, is an estimation of expansion, and brown or pink, depending on, I don't know if I'm colorblind. Those of you are not colorblind. I don't know what color that is, but in any case, it suggests basically a contraction, right? And you can see that towards the later part of the year, there was a sentiment that, in fact, the economic activity was going to contract. That has, we will see, I'll mention later on that, in fact, that has sort of changed a bit, but at least through 2022, there was a sentiment that, in fact, there's going to be a lot of economic contraction. In fact, there was a fear that the global economy was going to go into a recession. And this matters a lot for African economies because, A, there are three major trading partners: the United States, European Union, and China were all going through uncertain times, right? The US at the time was really dealing with inflation that hasn't been around for almost 40 years, right? And there was a lot of concerns about how resilient they can be. Europe was dealing with war and high prices of gas, and there was a lot of the economy was going to contract in Europe, and China was doing a lot of lockdowns for months and months, and the factories were shut, and therefore, as a major source of African commodity exports, there was a lot of economic contraction, right? So there was a lot of fear that because of what was going on in the three trading partners for the region, the economic activities were going to be contracting, and that's exactly what happened, right? Growth was about 3.3%, and that may seem like reasonable compared to global growth that was about 2.5% at the last year. But if you account for population growth, which is about 2.6, 2.7% in Africa, in per capita terms, you're basically talking about growth that is less than 1%, right? So it was pretty low. This and so this matters because so they earn less in their exports. The source and these three major trading partners are also major sources of investment flows. So if there's a contraction in these countries, or there's uncertainty or a slowdown even, then you would expect to see actually that investment flows into the continent are also going to slow down, and that's exactly what we witness. And so in general, that will depress economic depress economic activity. The second reason why we think economic growth slowed down was, of course, inflation, right? These are rates of inflation that haven't been seen in decades, right? Up to about 2021, the median inflation in Africa, in a lot of African countries, was about 5% or 4%. By 2022, it had doubled. It was up to 8%, right? And that's not all the picture. If you look at the right side of the graph, you will see that in fact, about 19 countries were already dealing with double-digit inflation, which is pretty high. It's not something they've seen in decades, or it's something that they thought they had actually left behind. And inflation directly affects consumption of households, but indirectly it also actually affects investments domestically because of high interest rates that we will see shortly, right? So that's the second, and it puts a lot of pressure on households' living conditions as well. The third reason why, and you can see, I put this in this graph here. The main reason why inflation was really running high was because of food inflation. It wasn't. The rest of inflation, was high, of course, but food was running ahead of the rest of the, non-food inflation, and that's primarily because of three things. One is the Ukraine war. A lot of these countries were importing a lot of their grain from Ukraine, so that has actually affected supply chains, but also bad weather. A lot of countries that were hit with really bad weather. The Horn of Africa is a classic example where they've now had 3 years of drought, and then of course the Sahel as well, but also localized conflicts. And then in some places you get floods, especially in places like Madagascar and Mozambique and so on, right? So bad weather all around. Some dry, some very too wet and too floody, and then conflict, right? So a combination of those things is what has led to higher food prices, and then the third reason is because of what is going on in the global financial markets, right? So three things about that. One is, because a lot of the rich countries, major trading partners, the United States, EU, the European Central Bank, were fighting inflation, interest rates have gone up. The rise in interest rates basically makes it difficult for these countries to actually borrow in order to finance their development. So suddenly they are basically just kind of cut off from the bond market, Euro bonds or dollar-denominated bonds, right? They don't have access to that. Two, because a lot of their debt is actually dollar-denominated or euro-denominated, the debt servicing costs also rise, right? So just as an example, in 2010, the average debt servicing cost for a lot of African countries as a share of their revenues was about 5%. right? So manageable. By 2022, it was 16%. So it tripled, right? So not only can you borrow, but the amount of money you collect domestically is spent on debt servicing. And that's just the average. It's much higher for some countries, right? And then the third thing is that the rise of the dollar, the strengthening of the dollar puts a lot of pressure on domestic currencies. So they depreciate relative to the dollar. And because a lot of their imports are denominated in dollars, the import costs are higher, right? And that also fuels inflation. So, people talk a lot about, oh, this is, imported inflation. I mean, that's exactly how the channel works, right? And that also puts a lot of pressure then on central banks to raise rates even more and depress economic activity because interest rates are now much higher, right? So you can see that there's this kind of vicious downward spiral of a lot of things that actually coalesce around these events. That's why people have called them polycrisis. On the right-hand side of these graphs, you can see, for example, these are emerging market bond indices, sovereign spreads, right? And you can see, you can see, for example, over time it has gone up, right? So that's the key thing. That's the key message. But what it means basically is that if you basically took a treasury instrument, right? Like let's say the treasury instrument that the U.S. Fed actually issues, that is of a particular maturity, maybe 10 years, right? If you took a similar kind of treasury for a typical African country, and there are a number of countries here that are listed, and you see what the premium is that they have to pay above what the US actually pays, right? And you index that to 2021, December, so let's say, for example, in 2021 December, the US was paying 2%, for example, for that particular debt instrument. And say a typical African country was paying 5% premium. So they're paying 7%, right? What this graph shows you is how many times that has increased, that premium has increased, right? In some cases, it has doubled, right? Instead of paying, 7%, now they're paying 14%. Right, and so on and so on. And that's what I meant by saying that they basically got shut out of the market. Right, it's just too expensive for them to actually borrow from these markets. It's come down a little bit. It's eased, but it's still pretty high. Then the final reason why growth was subdued for the year was precisely because these countries have just run out of fiscal space to actually finance development. Or to deal with the crisis, right? Governments are supposed to be sources of last resort when it comes to real depressed economic activities. They are the ones who are supposed to step in and spend and show up, private sector activity. But in this case, what happened is that because these countries had to deal with this massive shock from COVID, they have spent a lot of this fiscal space that they had, and now are running out of room. So, as an example, before COVID, let's take a markers, 2010. African debt was roughly 1/3 of GDP on average. Not every country is like that, but a lot of them were around there. As of 2022, that ratio has doubled. So we're up to 66% of GDP, right? And that's the average. And you can see, for example, that the graph on the right shows you that the number of countries that we will consider to be in debt distress, meaning they are really having difficulty meeting their financial obligations, has increased rapidly and tremendously, right? So about 7 countries are in debt distress, and then another 14 are basically in very high risk of debt distress, and the rest of them are in moderate risk. There's no country that is at low rate of debt distress. As you can see, the green the green bar basically disappears towards the end of the year, right? And so that's what these countries are facing. So very difficult fiscal situation for them. Now, and you can see the debt service. I'll skip this in the interest of time. You know, debt service ratios. You can see, for example, they have risen from around 10% to about 12% to about 16% in 2010. So what all this means, of course, is that we are basically looking at two things. One is unprecedented levels of food insecurity in the region, right? A combination of high inflation, bad weather, limited fiscal spaces for the governments to spend, has put lots of pressure on family finances and food security, right? So that's one outcome. The second outcome is basically no progress at all in poverty reduction, right? So this is a continent that has been reducing poverty slowly, not as fast as, say, East Asia or even South Asia, but nonetheless steady progress in reducing poverty over the decades, right? Especially when they were experiencing growth. But then there was a real setback during COVID, almost by 5 years, right? And we don't see anything in sight. There's no end in sight at the moment, given these low levels of growth, high levels of inflation, for these countries to get back to the trajectory they were on prior to COVID, right? So we now see this potential combustible situation where you have low growth, high levels of inflation, stagnant poverty reduction, or maybe even increasing poverty, and a lot of food insecurity, right? So it's not a very pretty condition. But nonetheless, these countries are basically they've been, they're resilient. Yeah, you see a lot of resilience in this. And then the other thing I want to mention is that, these countries have gained quite a lot of capabilities and experience dealing with these types of crises, right? So it's 2 decades of really knowing how to actually deal with inflation. So the central bankers have actually stepped up to the plate, and they have been able to do what is right to do. The policymakers are getting very serious about what we call fiscal consolidation, basically getting their finances in order, fiscal finances in order. That may come at some level of pain for the population, but at least it's better than running into a financial crisis. And so you can see that, in fact, there is some determination to try and actually manage the crisis. And then the final thing I want to say before I stop and then answer questions is that this is a very heterogeneous continent, okay? There are 48 countries here. And some of them have benefited significantly from the run-up of prices in minerals and oil and gas, right? But even the ones who are actually importers, and this is primarily countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, they have remained relatively resilient because they've kind of relied on a relatively diversified economies. And so they've been able to actually weather that the shocks that they have been experiencing. Now, so what is the outlook for 2023? So there is a tug of war going on now in 2023, basically, and I want to conclude with that. And what's the tug of war? Well, on the one hand, fortunately, the global growth might actually may have either bottomed or maybe even potentially grow. We might even see an uptick in growth. Why? Well, the US has turned out to be a very resilient economy. And the investments, I think, from the policies that have passed in the last 1 year potentially are going to actually jumpstart investments. Europe has escaped the worst of the gas prices. Gas prices haven't been nearly as high as they was expected, and the winter hasn't turned out to be as severe as it was expected, right? So in fact, it too might escape recession, although that is still to be seen. And China has opened up, has let go of these zero COVID policies, and therefore finally the economy, there's economic recovery. So there's some expectation that in fact these three major poles of global growth are turning out positive, right? So that's the good news. The bad news is that inflation is still too high, and those central bankers are basically they're basically saying, look, can't let go of the interest rate hikes yet. And so there's this tug of war going on, and how it lands, nobody knows. So that's the uncertainty. That's what we're kind of analyzing at the moment for our next update. And so stay tuned for it. Thank you. I just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of interesting things happening in the continent. It's these big mega trends that are happening for the continent, such as it is demographics, it is digital revolution uptake, this Pan-African trade that Flory mentioned at the beginning. So there's a lot going on, but we have, it will take a bit of time talking about these things, but these are some of the major mega trends that are going to probably influence the trajectory of this continent's growth for the next 2 or 3 decades. So it's, I'm happy to discuss this either now in question and answer, or come back and talk about specifically these issues and how they affect the continent. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really good overview of the key issues. I wonder if you would speak just a little bit to what the private sector, what the private sector, both the African private sector and more broadly the global private sector, particularly in the US, our members at CCA, we have both US and African members, but what should they think about? On the one hand, we've heard that this is a good time for people to invest in Africa, that there are shifts that are happening in regional and global supply chains where people are looking to Africa more. They've got the commodities and natural resources, they have the labor, they have the youth, a growing integrated market. But then some of the things you've mentioned might also make companies think that there's more risk. So I wonder if you could just sort of give us a sense for the private sector point of view, how to take account of the various megatrends you've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the thing to remember is that this is basically a short time outlook on the continent. Now, in the long run, actually, there are enormous opportunities for the private sector, both African private sector and also foreign direct private sector. One, let's start with geopolitics, okay, on the global development. So we don't know how that is going to look like, but what we've discovered, for example, or at least what is being debated out there in the global international development debate, is the need to actually balance efficiency of economic activity, which is what globalization offers, and resilience, which is what you really need to do to protect your supply chains, right? So that we don't have them really kind of freeze as they did during the pandemic, when in fact they're concentrated in one or few regions, right? So there is that tension that is going on. There is, those tensions are having debates, and there is, we don't know. There's a possibility that in fact, this is the fear, right? We all hope that it doesn't come to that, but the fear is that there's going to be some level of fragmentation of the trade regime, right? But that's an opportunity for a continent like Africa, I would say, right? Because then they can actually get into this global or regional supply chain. So that's one set of opportunity that's available. Two, there is a commitment to this continental free trade, right? Individually, these African countries are too tiny to be very attractive for major businesses, right? But if you can locate in any one of these countries and supply a much larger market, It doesn't even have to be continental, to be honest with you, as long as it is sub-regional. All right, let's take West Africa, right? Potentially 400 million people. You take Eastern Africa, another 400 million people, right? And you can see how if you basically if you say, okay, I'm going to play in the Eastern African market or the Western African market, you can easily be a major, you can easily have a much larger market than you would if you actually went to a country that is 20 million people, right? But that's just, I'm just saying that's just the calculation one can make. If it in fact opens up completely, that's, a potential, not even 1.2. If you add North Africa, it's larger than that, right? So that's the second major opportunity that's available to private sector. The third is the fact that this is a young continent, right? It's going to be the major source of labor, basically for the globe, for the world, in the next 20, 30 years, right? And so, in that sense, and this is, this is a very young population that is very eager, that is very restless, that is that is pretty ambitious, that is connected to the world, that's very savvy technologically. So there are all kinds of things going for it. So you can rely on that as a source of labor and growth, right? So there are multiple. And then there are lots of investments. This continent is upgrading its infrastructure in terms of both hard infrastructure, roads. There's a lot of interest now building railways across to connect these countries and to build corridors of growth, and of course the digital revolution that has seen an incredible uptake in the continent, right? So there are these opportunities. Now there are also risks, but that's what development is about, right? Rewards come with risks. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, Dr. Yeah, of course. Dr. Dalman, thanks so much. I really do appreciate the comments. I'm Dave Rosenblum with Development Finance International. I wanted to build very quickly on Flory's really good point on the private sector engagement. And it's seen over the past several years kind of a restructuring of African debt away from some of the multilateral institutions into private sector debt. And there's a different philosophy that these countries have to take to service that debt. I was hoping you might be able to talk for just a second about that, and then very quickly talk about how the World Bank's restructuring may actually impact and accelerate the assistance that can be given to African countries.
So first on the debt, yes, in fact, the composition of debt for African countries has changed significantly. So I was just looking at my numbers. So the two fastest growing shares of debt in total debt for African countries are debt from China, which increased from 5 to about 12%, and debt from private sector bonds, issued bonds, which increased from, I think, about 18% to about 29%, right? So massive changes, right? And, as a result, you see the multilateral development banks, whether that's through the World Bank or IMF, African Development Bank or so, have actually remained relatively stable, about 33% throughout. So that has changed. Now that has huge implications about how you actually deal with debt resolution in Africa at the moment, right? And it has become very complicated. I have to be honest. So the G20 group of countries had issued some kind of a framework on how to deal with very difficult debt situations, which a lot of these countries are finding themselves, right? To date, there are 4 countries in Africa that have sought debt resolution under G20. A lot of them are watching to see what's going to happen, but it hasn't been very easy and to do debt resolution under G20, precisely because of the types of players, right? There are multiple players with different kinds of incentives And so it's been very difficult to actually come to a common agreement. And so that space at the moment is still, there's still a lot of negotiations going on between the private sector creditors, the Chinese, the Paris Club group of creditors, the multilateral development banks, and so on, right? So I think it's still very early to say how this is gonna land, but everyone is hopeful that in fact there's going to be some kind of an agreement about how to streamline the process and to give these countries some transparent way of debt resolution. So that's probably the best answer I can give at the moment, because I actually don't really have a concrete example of how this is going. I mean, Zambia is the first one that has gone, and it's been 2 years, and we still don't have a resolution. The second one is you mentioned about how the World Bank's, you said restructuring? Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, so there's something I'm sure you've heard of it. It's called Evolution Roadmap for the World Bank. So the World Bank has been asked to come up with a vision of its role that looks at its mission, its operating model, as well as its financing model, given the challenges that development community is facing, right? And so the idea is really to think about how the World Bank can become, it can really support a lot of these countries to transition to low carbon. That's one, but also to really bring a lot of financing to deal with a lot of global public goods, not just low carbon, but pandemics and ecosystem collapses and so lots of public goods issues out there. That conversation is still going on, right? And presumably, there's a lot of consultations going on between the member countries and the board of the World Bank. The main issues here are, first, what could the model that exists right now for the World Bank, or rather the mission of the World Bank, will it actually expand? Right? So there is some sense in which it's necessary to think about expanding the mission to actually include these global public goods, and not just reducing poverty and increasing shared prosperity. So I think nobody's going to be. That seems to be a reasonable position that a lot of people would accept. The main contention is going to come around the financing model, right? If you basically then expand what needs to be financed, right? Because that's what this means. That may mean that, in fact, you have to expand the financial capacity of the bank, and I think that is where right now there's not a lot of consensus. We'll see.
I think we have some questions from the online.
Yeah. So we know you have a hard deadline, so I'm going to couple of questions. Many want to see what will be the next, in terms of sectors, right? If you could project the next 5-10 years, which are the key sectors that companies should look at as they plan to invest on the continent, and maybe a little bit more on economic diversification. Question regarding if you think that the Nigerian government strategy to diversify the economy away from an oil-centric economy and bringing ag and other sectors have helped to buffer the globally induced economic downturn.
Okay, so the first question is, what are potential sectors for growth?
Yeah.
And then the second is specifically on Nigeria.
Nigeria.
And what about Nigeria?
So the question was around if you believe that the government's strategy to diversify the economy, especially bringing more ag diversification in the economy, has helped to alleviate the economic downturn.
Yeah. Okay. Very good questions. So So what sectors? Lots, all of them. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, look, this is a continent that just needs accumulation all over, right? Energy. 46, maybe 40% of Africans have access to energy, right? I mean, we are talking a lot about energy transition and so on. The major concern for Africans is the fact that they don't have energy. They don't have access to energy, right? So investments in energy, and there are lots of opportunities for investing in energy, right? Anywhere from hydro. I mean, even if you don't want to touch gas and oil and whatever, all right? Even if you don't want to go there. Although lots of countries, that's their resource, natural resource, right? That they have to exploit and they have to sell to the world in order to earn revenues, to develop their countries. But nonetheless, even if that is not, is out of the question, there's still a lot of opportunities for renewable energy investments, off-grid, mini grids, and hydro and so on and so on. So that's one. There's still a lot of opportunities to invest in, telecoms, right? Opening up data services. So one of the big challenges facing African countries at the moment is that, a lot of Africans have access to, they actually have access, they're covered. They live in an area covered by mobile phones and mobile access to internet. But lots of them don't use it because it's too costly, right? Now, that's not that means that there is a role for public policy here in order to try and improve competition, right? Obviously, but there is also a lot of opportunities for innovators like disruptors to come and invest in these sectors in order to actually bring prices down so that lots of people, but also to develop apps that people actually find useful, and so on and so on, right? So there's a lot of space in that. Roads. A lot of countries are, because they are running into fiscal space issues right now, they are really exploring PPPs, public-private partnerships. It's not an easy field, it's not an easy area, but there's a lot of interest in that. Air connectivity. It's a big problem in Africa. I mean, and especially in West Africa. It takes me sometimes something like 12 hours to get from Burkina Faso to Abuja. I mean, it's really not, it's terrible. And so, and I know that is not entirely to the private sector. There's a reason why the private sector is not involved, is because there's a lot of regulations and a lot of obstacles put in place by, policymakers. But that's something, we in the World Bank are trying to really convince governments to relax these issues. But that's one area. But agriculture is another one, particularly agriculture, right? Especially in terms of processing, warehousing, end consumer, right? Agricultural transformation in Africa is really one of the, I think, one of the major drags in economic transformation in the region. The fact that we haven't had it is a major problem for why there hasn't been massive reductions in poverty and transformations. But there are a lot of opportunities, both in terms of just production, but also anything in between, right? Like this, transportation, processing, insurance, the quality assurance, all kinds of things that are missing, all kinds of markets that are missing there. I can go on and on, right? So on Nigeria specifically, so instead of talking about Nigeria, let me talk about countries that are really too reliant on natural resources, right? They've had lots of difficulty diversifying. And there is a well-known economic reason for that, right? It started in Netherlands a long time ago. It's called the Dutch disease. But there is a lot they can do. The thing these countries can do is to diversify their assets, right? So diversification of the economy may be difficult because a lot of the sectors become very uncompetitive because the natural resource sucks up a lot of the factors of production, and so the prices go up for everyone. But they can actually invest in human capital, right? Build capital, roads, housing, power plants, right? So you build a lot of assets above ground to position yourself to become more resilient later on when there is a shock and a downturn, right? So that's the kind of things that we've been trying to encourage countries to think about doing. Okay. There's one hand out there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There is one hand out here.
Oh, yes,
Doctor, I apologize. Not your entire presentation. My name is Kip Ward. I'm on the board of the corporate council. I didn't turn this one on. Okay, I'll tone it down a bit then. Quick question. With respect to the mega trends, the great opportunities that exist, the resources, what would you say the single thing that threatens the economic outlook moving ahead, that threatens across the continent with respect to economic growth that is sustained, relevant, meaningful? What threatens that from your perspective in the most extreme way today, 10, 20, 30 years out?
Yeah, governance. Just governance. It's at the core of it. If you can sort that out, a lot is possible. Yeah, thank you.
So much. We appreciate your taking the time to come and speak with us, both physically here, those here, as well as those virtually joining us today. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and getting the latest update on 2023 economic outlook on the continent, as you promised. Okay, thank you. Please give a hand to Dr. Devlin.